One of the great rewards of working as an archivist in the National Archives is that one gets to meet some of the most enterprising, dedicated, and gifted scholars at work today. Those who know the value of archival research and are willing to put in the hours of careful sifting that such work requires. One such scholar, whom I got to know when she was working on her dissertation at Princeton under Professor James McPherson, was Jennifer L. Weber. Her dissertation, completed in 2003, formed the basis for her acclaimed first book, Copperheads, The Rise and Fall of Lincoln's Opponents in the North, published by Oxford University Press in 2006. Jenny started her professional life as a journalist, working for 4 California newspapers, on the last of which, the Sacramento Bee, she was, and I'm quoting, celebrity gossip columnist, copy and wire editor, close quote. Jenny later worked as a political aide in the California state legislature. A lifelong interest in the Civil War led her to abandon newspaper work to pursue advanced degrees in academia, enabling her to revel in research, teaching, and writing, which she loves. Her dissertation, The Divided States of America, Dissent in the Civil War North, won the 2005 Hay Nicolay Prize at the Abraham Lincoln Institute for the best graduate work related to Abraham Lincoln. At present, she is assistant professor of history at the University of Kansas, where she specializes in Civil War studies. She is now working on a book about conscription during the Civil War and the consolidation of federal power, and is also completing a volume for young readers on the Battle of Gettysburg. However, she has not lost her journalistic flair. When I asked her whether she would do a quick edit on a short essay I had written for the Robert E. Lee Bicentennial, she performed what she called a nip and tuck. That made the effort, if not worthy of celebrity gossip, at least readable. For that, and for her traveling from Lawrence to our symposium to share her findings, I am in her debt and honored to present to you Professor Jennifer L. Weber.
Sorry. Okay. Well, thank you, Mike, for that introduction. Speaking of people with whom you really can't get much done in this business, Mike Music's retirement was an enormous loss, I think, to all historians who do Civil War studies. And Mike has been just an invaluable source for me. I have personally ignored the inconvenient fact of his retirement and still email him for advice on what I should be looking at in the National Archives. And the other person I'd actually like to thank is Tom Schwartz, the state historian of Illinois, who I believe was probably the first person I actually talked to about this project, and who had some really fabulous suggestions for where to go with this particular project. So what I want to talk about today is this idea. We have all heard the Civil War talked about as the Brothers' War. What I would like to argue is that in the North, at least, the Civil War is also very much a neighbor's war. What you see in the North from the very beginning is profound opposition to the war. You see this mostly in voluminous letters to Republican governors saying things like, so-and-so here is huzzahing for Jefferson Davis. Please do something about this. Or there are 20 Republicans in this county. The Democrats are threatening to kill us all. Please send troops. Or you just named so-and-so major in this particular regiment. Do you have any idea what he's saying about Lincoln and that he's a Confederate sympathizer? You also see opposition from the war to the war from the very outset in Congress. There are a handful of congressmen who are speaking out against this war. The thing is, for the first year of the war, this really doesn't show up on the national radar at all. And I think it's because the country is really embroiled in this rage militaire. They're very excited about the war. They're optimistic about the outcome of the war. And they don't really notice that there is serious opposition, maybe not widespread, but serious pockets of opposition to the war in the North. So what changes? How does this come to the forefront? Well, we really see this happening in the summer of 1862, when the Union armies are not doing well at all. And that really illustrates the point that the opposition to the war, the influence that it bore, was in an inverse relationship to how well the armies were doing in the field. When the armies were doing well, the Copperheads were not all that powerful. When the armies were doing poorly, the Copperheads had enormous influence. And so, in a way, they were never in charge of their own fate. They were very much at the mercy of the armies. Well, who were these Copperheads who came to prominence in the summer of 1862? They really fell into three categories. One was that they were from the South or had some sort of connection to the South. Their parents had emigrated to the North from the South. The second category were immigrants, and particularly Catholic immigrants, who did not see this war as their fight. They really wanted to have nothing to do about it. And they particularly had no affection for Republicans. And they saw this very much as a Republican war and an abolitionist war. And they wanted no part of either one of those groups. And they certainly were not going to fight their battles for them. The third group of people are strict constructionists, people who have a very fundamentalist approach to the U.S. Constitution. And they offer a rhetorical framework, ultimately, under which these other groups began to gather. And they all ended up using the same kind of rhetoric, which was that everything that Lincoln was up to was unconstitutional. The ways he was prosecuting the war. In fact, they thought, many of them, that the war itself was unconstitutional. Remember, there's nothing in the Constitution about the terms of membership. There's nothing saying that once you sign up as a state, that you are in the Union forever. Nor does it say that you can secede. It's completely silent. And this is a question that ultimately the Civil War resolves, but it had been an issue since the Constitution was written itself. But these people think that Lincoln is a tyrant. He's already suspended habeas corpus. He's declared martial law in Maryland. He's raised troops without the consent of Congress. And for people who have a fundamentalist view of the Constitution, these are serious incursions on constitutional liberties and serious abuses of constitutional powers. And so they have grave concerns about what Lincoln is up to. They wind up coming together and rallying under a phrase that New York gubernatorial candidate Horatio Seymour has that summer. the nation as it was, the Union as it was, and the Constitution as it is. And that becomes their catchphrase for the rest of the war. Well, if they were concerned about what Lincoln was up to before September of 1862, that month really brings home for them their greatest fears. The Emancipation Proclamation, the preliminary version of it. Now, they have said through this whole war that the real object of this war is the abolition of slavery. People didn't necessarily believe this. Now they've been proven right. And they think also that emancipation itself is a serious encroachment on presidential powers and that it's unconstitutional. What's the outcome? Well, they do pretty well in the fall elections in 1862. The Copperheads and the Democrats generally have quite a good showing. They take control of the state legislatures of Illinois and Indiana. They take the governor's seats in New Jersey and most notably in New York. And Horatio Seymour becomes a persistent thorn in the side of Abraham Lincoln for most of the rest of the war. Well, the Copperheads are really on the rise through the late fall and winter of 1862 and then into 1863. And again, I don't need to tell you that this is because the Union armies are not doing well. There's an absolute fiasco at Fredericksburg, the embarrassment and humiliation of the Mud March, and Lincoln starts talking openly about what he calls the fire in the rear. Now, just as background, I actually thought about calling this book The Fire in the Rear. And I started running this idea around some of my friends who notified me of the scatological implications of this, which had really never dawned on me before. And thus, you don't see The Fire in the Rear as the actual title of this book, which is unfortunate. But there's good reason for Lincoln to be concerned. Opposition to the war is growing. And in the West, which we now think of as the Midwest, there is serious talk about parts of that region also seceding. There had been discussion of this all through the war, but this talk of secession in the West reaches a crescendo in January of 1863. And Lincoln had to feel that he was dealing with a battle on two fronts, the one in the front and, of course, the one in the rear. The soldiers, for their part, saw the Copperheads as a more dangerous threat than the Confederates themselves. And that's because they could see the rebels. They knew they were there. They knew what they were up to. They did not have that clarity on the Copperheads. And that made them very concerned. They were also really upset about what the Copperheads were saying, which was they were calling for an immediate cessation of hostilities. And the soldiers thought that this would deny their own sacrifices, their own suffering. I mean, you're talking about people who have lived outside for 2 years now, in the cold and the rain and the snow. They've been shot at, they've been wounded, they've suffered illness, they've seen their friends maimed and killed, and they did not want their sacrifice to be for nothing. And so they became highly politicized. It is a remarkable turn. Many soldiers who came into the Union armies as Democrats left as lifelong Republicans. They actively campaigned in their letters for Lincoln and the Republicans. And in fact, I think that they play an important part in maintaining Lincoln's political viability, even during his darkest days. Well, the soldiers don't feel any better about the Democrats when the most notorious Copperhead in the country, Clement Vallandigham, is arrested on charges of treason, convicted by a military tribunal, clapped into a military prison. Lincoln banishes him to the Confederacy, which is a great story unto itself, which, if you want, I can talk about later. And pops back up in Windsor, Ontario, across the river from Detroit. There's a gunboat. For the whole time he is in Ontario, sitting in the middle of the Detroit River with its guns trained right on his apartment. And from that apartment, he engineers his race for the governor of Ohio. The soldiers are outraged. This, as much as anything, consolidates them behind Lincoln and helps to swing opinion in the armies behind the Emancipation Proclamation. Initially, it had been very divisive within the Army, but I think that the opposition to the Copperheads and to Vallandigham really changes minds in all the armies of the Union. Well, the summer of 1863 actually goes a lot better for the Union forces with the big victories at Gettysburg and Vicksburg. The New York City draft riots don't really do anything to burnish their reputations. And going into the fall, Clement Vallandigham loses, and loses really big in Ohio. So we come into 1864 with the general public feeling pretty good about how this war is going. They think it's a matter of months until the war ends, and their hopes are only boosted further by the appointment of Ulysses S. Grant as the General-in-Chief of all the armies. And, of course, Grant is going to be traveling with the star-crossed Army of the Potomac, which leads many people in the North to think that finally he will bring victory to the Union. Grant starts his campaign, his overland campaign. One historian called him a pitiless little man. And he certainly bore that out in the overland campaign. Unlike the previous commanders of the Army of the Potomac, he insisted on pursuing Lee, even if he lost the battle, even if the battle was a draw. Lee would move south, and Grant would follow him. He chased him all over central Virginia. In 6 weeks, he took 64,000 casualties. And what did he have to show for this? He wound up in a siege outside of Petersburg, just south of Richmond. Grant, who had come into the year being known as Unconditional Surrender Grant, now became known as Grant the Butcher. All those lives, all those men, and it looked like for nothing. And the situation didn't look much better in the other principal armies of the Union either. Banks had tried to move from Louisiana into Texas, got turned around at Shreveport, and wound up spending the summer sitting on his hands in New Orleans. Sherman was going to go out after Atlanta. And like Grant, he got stuck in a siege. And so you have even Republicans now turning on Lincoln, begging him to end the war. This shroud of war weariness had settled hard on the northern population, and an awful lot of people just wanted this war to end. They really didn't care how. They didn't really care at what cost. They just wanted it to stop. The most prominent Republican editor in the country, the Tribune's Horace Greeley, wrote Lincoln a letter begging him to bring peace to his troubled nation. But the problem was this. Lincoln had two conditions for peace. One was emancipation, the other was reunion. He saw these as non-negotiable. Jefferson Davis had one condition for peace, which he also saw as non-negotiable, and that was Confederate independence. As long as these two men were in control of their respective countries, there could not be a negotiated peace because their aims were completely contradictory. They could not have come to a settlement. But the public in the North didn't really understand that, didn't really care, didn't want to see it. They just wanted the war to end. By August, everybody thinks Lincoln is going to lose this war. And by everybody, I mean including Lincoln. Lincoln writes what's a fairly famous memo instructing his cabinet what to do during the transition to the next administration. He tucks it in an envelope, seals the envelope, has all the members of his cabinet sign the envelope without ever knowing what the contents of the envelope are. The chair of the Republican Party comes to Lincoln and suggests, as so many other people had, that Lincoln abandon emancipation as a condition for peace. Now, this is a pretty remarkable occurrence coming from the man who's heading a party that was explicitly founded on an anti-slavery platform. He may have been wanting to smoke out Jefferson Davis to give Lincoln cover, that it wasn't Lincoln's fault, it was Davis who was the problem, and this would illustrate this for the Northern public. And Lincoln thought about this advice. In fact, he wrote out a memo to send an emissary to Richmond and propose dropping emancipation as a condition for peace if the Confederacy would just rejoin the Union and they could end the war. And then Lincoln, as was his habit, stuck the letter in a desk drawer. And he thought about it for 24 hours. And he realized he couldn't do this. He said he would be damned for all eternity if he did this, if he broke his promise to the slaves, to the contrabands, to the free blacks who had come into the Union Army, had provided so much effort for the Union cause in the name of their own freedom. Lincoln could not sell them out. And so he comes to the most critical decision of his career. The decision that he would rather be right, that he would rather stay on the moral side of this equation than president. Well, the Democrats go into their convention at the end of that month, and boy, do they feel good. This is looking fabulous. As far as they're concerned, they have a slam dunk coming right at them in November. Thinking that the Union soldiers were still loyal to McClellan, a war Democrat, they put McClellan at the top of the ticket. But in an indication of how powerful the Copperheads have become, they're very close to taking over their own party. They put one of the most infamous Copperheads, a congressman from Ohio, on the ticket as the vice presidential nominee. And here comes Clement Vallandigham, who has snuck back into the country from Canada, hoping to be arrested. Lincoln disappoints him on this count, won't arrest him. The Democrats put Vallandigham in charge of their platform. And the platform calls for an immediate cessation of hostilities and terms the war a failure. This ultimately proves to be an enormous millstone for the party. But for the moment, things look absolutely terrific. And they leave Chicago on the 31st of August, knowing they have this in the bag. It is theirs. Now, nobody's quite planning for the change of interior decoration in the White House yet, but I'm sure Mrs. McClellan was thinking about it. And then within 48 hours, the Confederates withdraw from Atlanta. Sherman takes the city. And this is, in my view, quite possibly the most extraordinary moment in American political history, because what happens is that public opinion does a 180 literally overnight. Suddenly, Americans who had given up on the war now see, they firmly believe that they have won the war, that from this point out, they're just playing out the clock, that they absolutely have this won. The victory is in grasp. The Democrats, the leading politicians at least, don't quite understand this. They still think they've got something going. They still think that the soldiers are going to come in behind them. The Democrats in the field know differently. They're very concerned. But the party itself is kind of rumbling blithely along. But Northern opinion has changed dramatically here. And of course, the victory in Atlanta is just followed up by Sheridan's success in the Valley and by other military successes elsewhere. And suddenly, this wave, this tide of victories is insurmountable. And riding at the very crest of that wave is Abraham Lincoln, who wins the 1864 election in a landslide. The Copperheads go down to historical ignominy, and they take the Democratic Party with them. It would be about 2 generations before the Democrats really overcame what the Republicans called the smell of treason about them. It would be until really the Civil War generation completely died off that the Democrats would no longer have that taint of treason about them. However, this was a pretty close call. I think that the Civil War would very likely have had a different outcome had the Copperheads and the Democrats and McClellan been successful in the fall of 1864. I think we would have taken a very different course had that happened. Thank you. And once again, Fred reminds me to ask you to speak into the mic, please, with any questions you might have.
Is the mic on? I'm sorry. You characterize the Democratic Party as being suffering ignominy after the war. Isn't that an exaggeration? In 1868, Horatio Seymour was the nominee of the Democratic Party, probably next to Vallandigham, the most outspoken Copperhead in the nation, the most powerful. And he was the nominee. It was a competitive campaign. Grant won, but it was a competitive campaign. In 1874, there was a recession. The country turned to the Democrats. The Democrats won the House. Would have won the Senate. Would have won the presidency if it hadn't been stolen in 1876. So it really could ignominy be an accurate characterization of the Democratic Party after the war?
Well, I see your point, but I think that they could not hold on to these offices for very long, as opposed to the Republicans who really dominated government up until Woodrow Wilson's time in particular. We had one Democratic president elected twice, but they were not really able to keep a firm hold on government. The Republicans kept coming back. And I think this is largely because many of the Union veterans were voting Republican, and they were having their friends and neighbors vote Republican as well. I mean, the GAR has been known as, the great, one of the great wings of the Republican Party. And I think they were very instrumental in keeping power in Republican hands. Everybody's waiting for lunch.
Hello. Have you uncovered anything of interest, possibly new material regarding the plan to buy out the slaves at the beginning of the dangerous hostilities that were looming and avoid the war?
I'm sorry, plans to buy out the slaves? No, I haven't. And then Ron has one too.
Jenny, go on for a few more sentences in your talk. What would have happened if Atlanta had not been taken and McClellan had been elected? I have a memory of you and Bill Freeling exchanging emails with different opinions about whether how soon what kind of peace, what would have happened to the war and to slavery if McClellan had been elected.
Bill and I have a running debate on this. Every time I see him, we pick it back up again. And that's all thanks to you, Bill. So thanks very much.
The first bill is Bill Freeling. The second bill is me.
Sorry, and Bill Miller here. Okay, but my own belief, and of course this is all counterfactual, so my opinion has no more weight than anybody else's on this particular score. I think that had McClellan been elected president, I think he would have been under tremendous pressure from the Copperheads to have a negotiated peace with the Confederates. McClellan had no strong feelings about slavery. He was no friend of the slaves, and I think it would have been very easy for him to let slavery go. I don't think he would have thought twice about it, about letting slavery go as a condition for reunion. I don't see McClellan as being a man with a powerful moral center. Nor is he particularly decisive. And I think it would have been pretty easy to convince him to let the Confederates go altogether, just to call it a day, particularly if war weariness had maintained, as I think it would have for him. That would have been a precursor, I think, for his election. And I think that he would have had a great deal of support, actually, in that.
So you would get a negotiation in which there would be a new Confederate state to the south, and history would go on in a radically different direction.
Yeah, and I can play that. I can game that out for you well into the 20th century, but I don't know if we want to take on that much time.
Thank you.
Okay. Thanks, Bill.
Well, first a comment. McClellan wouldn't have taken over to March 4th, 1865, when the war was pretty well won, and I'm not sure that scenario. My question is this. I have a very conservative, but still a friend who calls opponents of the Iraq War Copperheads. I don't quite agree with that analogy, but I wonder what your thoughts are.
That only took us 7 minutes to get to. I've been waiting for this one. Okay. I know that there is a lively blogosphere out there talking about the Copperheads of today are just like the Copperheads of yesterday. To me, there certainly is an echo effect here. The fact that you have people who have serious questions about whether this war is legal, how we got into this war, and have grave concerns about civil liberties and the methods that the president is using to prosecute the war. That said, I don't think these wars are particularly analogous. We got into these wars in very different ways. The stakes are very different. People at the time of the Civil War were really convinced, people in the North, that the future of the Republic was at stake. And I think that there's some good reason to believe that. I don't think serious people are saying about this war that the very survivability of the nation is contingent on the outcome of this war. There are other things that are contingent on the outcome of this war, but that probably is not one of them. The other thing that I think is important to remember in the case of our Civil War, at least, is there's really good reason to be concerned about what people are up to. Remember, the enemy in that war looks like you, talks like you, more or less, has a common heritage, has a similar set of base beliefs with significant differences in there, but the idea that, we're fighting for the Constitution, we believe in the Declaration of Independence. Both sides really see themselves as carrying out the mission of the Founding Fathers. And you don't have that here. You don't have the enemy living across the river from you here in this particular war. And I think that is a significant and profound difference here.
I thank you. I just want to note the new president of Harvard is a woman Civil War historian, so you have something to look forward to.
I have to get tenure first.
Two really quick...
The academics think that's a riot.
Two really quick questions.
Okay.
First of all, you mentioned how the Midwestern states in the rear, some of them might have seceded. Mm-hmm. Does that mean joining the Confederacy or just being sovereign states? And the other one is, maybe you can tell us how Clement Vallandigham met his end? And those are the only two.
Okay. The answer to your first question is both. There was discussion both about joining the Confederacy and forming yet a third country out of the United States. So there hadn't been sort of a general consensus on that. Vallandigham met his end in a very interesting way. He had been defeated in 1862 as a member of Congress and had gone back when he returned to the United States to practicing as a lawyer. And he had been defending a murder suspect in, Hamilton, I think, Ohio. Anyway, in Ohio, so between Cincinnati and Dayton. And he was rehearsing one night what he was going to say to the jury the next day. Well, the way that things had gone with this defendant was he said that he'd gotten into a tussle with the person who eventually was killed, that a gun had gone off, that it was accidental, and that potentially the victim had shot himself in this tussle. So Vallandigham was practicing that, and he had a gun in his pocket, and he was sort of demonstrating this. His stories differ about, was it before a group of other attorneys to get some feedback from them about how did this look? Or was he in his room? Was this suicide, or was this an accident? In any case, he had this gun in his pocket, and he wound up shooting himself through the bowels. And suffered for about 24 hours, long enough to send a telegram to his family telling them he was dying. And he died the next day. Okay.
Maybe I misunderstood what you said, but I think you maybe oversimplified the immigrant Irish and German contribution. There were about 950,000 immigrants who came to the North during the Civil War. I know in the 1850s, the regular army was mostly Irish Army and Marines, so that the Irish were very important, and then the Germans too, fleeing the 48 revolutions. Carl Schurz, you had German regiments. It's sort of an irony, I think, that the draft riots in New York City in '63, they sent some Irish regiments too. I mean, that was Irish, mostly the population. So I think, the immigrant and the use of the black troops. John Andrew in Massachusetts was a typical conscience Whig, free soiler Republican. Before Lincoln was a Republican, '54, and during the Know Nothing interlude, of course, he was completely opposed to nativism. So he made sure to praise the Irish, and the Irish, even though 5 Irish militia companies were abolished after the Anthony Burns case. 21 companies that supposedly were keeping the peace to march him a third of the mile down to the U.S. revenue cutter, ship him back. A couple of those went underground, and they were already ready to go and fight in the war when it broke out. In fact, of course, the Massachusetts regiments were the first to get to White House.
Okay, well, you just caught me in a trim for a 35-minute speech. You're absolutely right, but at the same time, in terms of who composed the Copperheads, those immigrants, and particularly the Catholic immigrants, were an important component of it. But you are right that a number of Irish and Germans believed in the Union cause and fought for it.
Jennifer, in your studies of the opposition to Lincoln in the North, did you run across the old Whig opposition, who still call themselves constitutional unionists, people like John Todd Stewart, who we've mentioned here before as Lincoln's law partner, Robert C. Winthrop, who opposed slavery from Boston, who had been Speaker of the House, and there were, of course, the border state people. Did you run across them? If so, how important were they in this opposition? They supported the war, is my understanding, but they opposed Lincoln because they didn't think that under Lincoln's leadership, the war could be won. Would you comment on that? Okay.
Well, no, I didn't run across them. I wish I'd talked to you before. I really was looking principally at Democrats. I very specifically did not look at the border states because to me it seemed like the big news here was that there was so much opposition to the war in the North and that nobody knows about. It's not surprising that there's opposition in border states. And so I just avoided them completely because that's what you would expect. I was really going after what was unexpected to me, at least. So, but great question. Thank you.
We'll have more questions later when we have the panel, so would you, I'm sorry, we have to save your question for a little bit later, if we would.
Okay.
Jenny, thank you very, very much.